The provisions for biotech are really a way of increasing trade barriers and forcing consumers to subsidize the TNCs engaged in agribusiness. The U.S. seeks to apply patents to genetically modified organisms, effectively pirating the work of generations of third-world breeders by isolating beneficial genes in traditional varieties and incorporating them in new GMOs, and maybe even enforcing patent rights against the traditional variety which was the source of the genetic material. For example, Monsanto has attempted to use the presence of their DNA in a crop as prima facie evidence of pirating, when it is much more likely that their variety cross-pollinated and contaminated the farmer's crop against his will. The Pinkerton Agency, by the way, plays a leading role in investigating such charges. That's right, the same folks who have been breaking strikes and kicking organizers downstairs for the past century. Even jackbooted thugs have to diversify to make it in the global economy. The developed world has pushed particularly hard to protect industries relying on or producing generic technologies, and to restrict diffusion of dual-use technologies. The U.S.-Japanese trade agreement on semiconductors, for example, is a cartel-like managed trade agreement. So much for, quote-unquote, free trade. Patent law traditionally required a holder to work the invention in a country in order to receive patent protection. UK law allowed compulsory licensing after 3 years if an invention was not being worked, or being worked fully, and demand was met to a substantial extent by importation, or where the export market was not being supplied because of the patentee's refusal to grant licenses on reasonable terms. The central motivation in the GATT intellectual property regime, however, is to permanently lock in the collective monopoly of advanced technology by TNCs, and prevent independent competition from ever arising in the Third World. It would, as Martin Korkok-Peng writes, effectively prevent the diffusion of technology to the Third World, and would tremendously increase monopoly royalties of the TNCs, whilst curbing the potential development of Third World technology. Only 1% of patents worldwide are owned in the Third World. Of patents granted in the 1970s by Third World countries, 84% were foreign-owned. But fewer than 5% of foreign patents were actually used in production. As we saw before, the purpose of owning a patent is not necessarily to use it, but to prevent anyone else from using it. Raghavan summed up nicely the effect on the Third World. Given the vast outlays in R&D and investments, as well as the short life cycle of some of these products, the leading industrial nations are trying to prevent emergence of competition by controlling the flows of technology to others. The Uruguay round is being sought to be used to create export monopolies for the products of industrial nations, and block or slow down the rise of competitive rivals, particularly in the newly industrializing Third World countries. At the same time, the technologies of senescent industries of the North are sought to be exported to the South under conditions of assured rentier income. Corporate propagandists piously denounce anti-globalists as enemies of the Third World, seeking to use trade barriers to maintain an affluent Western lifestyle at the expense of the poor nations. The above measures, trade barriers, to permanently suppress Third World technology and keep the South as a big sweatshop, give the lie to this, quote, humanitarian concern. This is not a case of differing opinions, or of sincerely mistaken understanding of the facts. Setting aside false subtleties, what we see here is pure evil at work, Orwell's boot stamping on a human face forever. If any architects of this policy believe it to be for general human well-being, it only shows the capacity of ideology to justify the oppressor to himself and enable him to sleep at night.